The train rolled through the endless expanse of Texas prairie like a metal serpent cutting through an ocean of grass, carrying within its weathered cars men who had crossed an ocean not by choice but by circumstance, not as conquerors but as the conquered. Klaus Bergman pressed his face against the smudged window, watching the landscape transform from the humid density of the coastal plains into something vast and incomprehensible, a terrain that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of memory itself. He had expected America to be many things, industrial, cold, punishing, but never had he imagined this raw emptiness that somehow felt more alive than any battlefield he had known. The other prisoners sat in various states of resignation and curiosity, their gray uniforms marking them as property of a war they had lost, soldiers who had survived when so many had not. Werner Koch, who had once been a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the Wehrmacht consumed his life, sat beside Klaus with his hands folded in his lap like a penitent in church. Franz Müller, the youngest among them at barely 22, stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much too soon. They were fragments of a shattered army, pieces of something that had once believed itself invincible, now reduced to cargo being shipped to an uncertain future in a land they had been taught to despise. The train slowed as it approached a town that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, buildings made of wood and stone that looked as though they had grown organically from the red dirt. A sign passed by the window, "Welcome to Hereford, Texas." The name meant nothing to Klaus, just another point on a map in a country that had become his prison. But as the train finally groaned to a stop and the guards began shouting orders in that sharp American English that still sounded foreign to his ears, he noticed something unexpected in the faces of the people gathered at the small station. They were not the faces of hatred he had braced himself to meet. They were curious, certainly, and cautious, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like concern. An older man in worn denim and a hat that had seen too many seasons stood with his arms crossed, watching the prisoners disembark with an expression that Klaus could not quite decipher. Beside him stood a woman with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her weathered hands clutching a basket covered with a checkered cloth. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, peeked out from behind his mother's skirts, his eyes wide with the fearless fascination of childhood. The prisoners were herded into trucks, military vehicles that kicked up clouds of dust as they headed away from the small town and deeper into ranch country. Klaus found himself gripping the side of the truck bed as it bounced over rutted roads, the landscape becoming increasingly sparse and strangely beautiful in its desolation. Cattle dotted the horizon like dark punctuation marks in a sentence written across the land. Windmills turned slowly in the hot breeze, their creaking rhythm a soundtrack to this alien world. The camp itself was nothing like the films had suggested. There were no high concrete walls topped with barbed wire, no guard towers casting ominous shadows. Instead, a series of simple wooden barracks sat arranged in neat rows, surrounded by fencing that seemed almost apologetic in its construction. Beyond the fence, the prairie continued uninterrupted, offering the illusion that one could simply walk away into that vastness and disappear. But Klaus understood, as they all did, that the true prison here was not the fence but the sheer impossibility of escape into such an unforgiving landscape. Where would they go? How would they survive? The commandant, Captain James Morrison, addressed them that first evening with words translated by a German-American sergeant who spoke their language with a Chicago accent that made some of the prisoners smile despite themselves. Morrison was a tall man with lines around his eyes that suggested he had spent his life squinting into the sun, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "You men are prisoners of war," he said, "but you are still men. You will be treated with respect as long as you give respect in return. You will work, as that is the agreement under the Geneva Convention, but you will be compensated. You will eat, you will sleep, you will write letters home. This is not a punishment camp. This is simply where you wait for the war to end." That night, lying on a thin mattress in a barack that smelled of fresh pine and dust, Klaus listened to the sounds of men breathing in the darkness, each lost in their own private contemplations of this strange turn of fate. He thought of his wife, Greta, whom he had not seen in 3 years, her face growing hazier in his memory with each passing month. He thought of his home in Bavaria, the mountains that framed his childhood, the crisp cold of winter mornings, and the way sunlight looked filtering through the stained glass of the village church. All of it felt impossibly distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The work began the next morning, and it was work they understood, labor with their hands, simple and honest and somehow healing after the abstract horror of war. They were taken to nearby ranches where cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, irrigation systems needed maintaining. The ranchers who employed them were men carved from the same essential material as the land itself, hard and practical and surprisingly free of malice. They showed the prisoners what needed to be done with few words and much demonstration, treating them not as enemies but as workers who happened to have come from very far away. Thomas Mackenzie owned a spread that stretched for thousands of acres, a kingdom of grass and cattle that he ruled with calloused hands and practical wisdom. He was a man in his 50s who had never left Texas except for a brief stint in the previous war, and he looked at the German prisoners with the same evaluating gaze he gave his horses, assessing their capability, their trustworthiness, their essential nature. Klaus found himself assigned to Mackenzie's ranch along with Werner and Franz, the three of them riding in the back of a pickup truck each morning, bouncing over the rough terrain while the sun rose like liquid gold over the endless horizon. The first time Mackenzie offered them water from his own canteen, Klaus hesitated, uncertain if this was some kind of test or trick. But the rancher simply thrust the container at him with an impatient gesture that suggested he had better things to do than play games, and Klaus drank, the water cool and sweet and tasting of life itself. Werner took the canteen next, and then Franz, and something shifted in that moment, something small but significant, like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw. They learned to speak to each other in a hybrid language of necessity, the prisoners' broken English meeting the ranchers' complete absence of German somewhere in the middle ground of gestures and repeated words and shared laughter at mutual incomprehension. Franz, who had studied some English in school before the war interrupted everything, became their translator, though his vocabulary was limited to formal textbook phrases that often proved hilariously inadequate for the rough vernacular of ranch work. When Mackenzie told them to cut them steers from the main herd, Franz translated something about separating the young bulls with surgical precision, which left Klaus and Werner staring at him in confusion while Mackenzie shook his head and simply showed them what he meant. The rhythm of ranch life began to seep into their bones, replacing the sharp anxiety of war with something slower and more ancient. They rose with the sun and worked until their muscles ached with the good pain of honest labor. They learned to fix fences, stretching wire with tools that felt like extensions of their own hands. They learned to handle cattle, those massive creatures with surprising intelligence in their eyes, guiding them from one pasture to another with patience and persistence. They learned to read the land, understanding which areas had been grazed too heavily and needed rest, where water collected after rare rains, how the wind patterns shifted with the changing seasons. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the ranchers began to see them not as Germans or enemies or even prisoners, but simply as men who worked hard and asked for little. Mackenzie started packing extra sandwiches in the lunch basket his wife prepared, thick slabs of beef between homemade bread that tasted better than anything Klaus had eaten in years. Other ranchers followed suit, adding apples from their orchards, cookies baked by daughters, thermoses of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The prisoners accepted these offerings with gratitude that went beyond words, understanding that in this gesture of sharing food, they were being acknowledged as human beings rather than as abstract political entities. One evening in late summer, after a particularly long day repairing a windmill that had broken in a storm, Mackenzie surprised them by announcing they would eat at his house. Klaus, Werner, and Franz exchanged glances of uncertainty, unsure if they had understood correctly, but Mackenzie was already walking toward his truck, clearly expecting them to follow. They climbed into the bed of the pickup, their work clothes dusty and sweat-stained, and rode the 2 miles to the Mackenzie homestead as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, like colors from a dream. The house was a low, sprawling structure built to withstand the wind and heat, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and rocking chairs that moved gently in the evening breeze. Mrs. Mackenzie appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her face showing neither surprise nor alarm at the sight of 3 German prisoners climbing out of her husband's truck. She was a woman whose life had taught her to take things as they came, and she simply nodded and said, "Wash up at the pump over there. Dinner's almost ready." They stood at the pump in a daze, taking turns working the handle while cold water splashed over their hands and faces, washing away the dust of the day. Franz whispered in German, "Is this really happening?" And Werner replied, "I think we may have died and gone to some very strange heaven." Klaus said nothing, but his hands trembled slightly as he dried them on the rough towel hanging from a nail on the porch post. Inside, the house smelled of cooking meat and baked bread and something sweet that made Klaus's stomach clench with sudden homesickness. The dining room table was set with mismatched plates and worn silverware, but it was set with care, with cloth napkins folded beside each plate and glasses filled with cold tea. Mackenzie gestured for them to sit, and they did, carefully, as though the chairs might break beneath the weight of this impossible situation. Mrs. Mackenzie brought out platters of food: roasted chicken with crispy skin that crackled when carved, mashed potatoes swimming in butter and cream, green beans cooked with bacon, cornbread that steamed when broken open, and gravy rich enough to make a man weep. The prisoners stared at this abundance, remembering the thin soup and hard bread that had sustained them for years, the slow starvation of the final months of the war. Mackenzie said grace, his words simple and direct, thanking God for the food, the rain, the health of his family, and asking for protection for all men far from home. He did not specify which men, and Klaus understood that the prayer somehow included them in its generous embrace. They ate slowly at first, uncertain of the etiquette, worried about taking too much or eating incorrectly. But the Mackenzies ate with unself-conscious enjoyment, passing dishes and encouraging seconds, and gradually the prisoners relaxed into the meal. Mrs. Mackenzie asked questions through Franz's halting translations. Where were they from? Did they have families? What had they done before the war? They answered carefully, editing out the parts that felt too heavy for this table, focusing instead on the ordinary details of their former lives. Klaus spoke of his work as a carpenter, his pride in building things that would last. Werner described his students, the joy of watching young minds grasp difficult concepts. Franz, with the particular pain of youth interrupted, talked about his plans to study engineering, dreams that the war had temporarily suspended. The Mackenzie's daughter, Sarah, who was 16 and curious in that way of teenagers who have not yet learned to mask their interest, asked if they missed home. The question hung in the air for a moment, its simplicity containing multitudes. Klaus looked at her young face, open and genuinely concerned, and felt something break open inside his chest. "Every moment," he said in English, the words clear despite his accent. "Every single moment." Sarah's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and her mother reached over to squeeze her hand, a gesture that somehow included all of them in its comfort. After dinner, they sat on the porch as darkness settled over the prairie like a blanket, the stars emerging in such profusion that Klaus felt dizzy looking up at them. Mackenzie brought out a bottle of whiskey and poured small measures into glasses, handing them around without ceremony. They sipped in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds, crickets singing their endless song, cattle lolling in distant pastures, the wind moving through the grass with a whisper that sounded almost like human voices. Werner, emboldened by the whiskey and the unexpected kindness, asked the question that had haunted them all since arriving: "Why do you treat us this way? We are your enemies. We fought against your country." Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment, rolling his glass between his palms, watching the amber liquid catch the light from the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "My daddy fought in the First War," he said. "Came back with stories about German soldiers in the trenches who were just scared boys far from home, same as him. He said the real enemy wasn't the men across from him but the damn fools who started the whole mess in the first place." I figured he knew what he was talking about. He paused, took a sip. "Besides, I judge a man by how he works and how he treats others, not by what government he happened to be born under. You boys work hard, you don't cause trouble, you're decent folk as far as I can tell. That's good enough for me." Mrs. Mackenzie added quietly, "Our son is in France. We pray every night that if he's captured, someone will show him the same mercy we show you. It's not complicated, really. Do unto others, like the good book says. Everything else is just noise." Klaus felt tears prick his eyes and was grateful for the darkness that hid his face. He had not cried since his capture, had not allowed himself that release, but something about this simple act of human decency undid him in ways that brutality never could. He thought of the men he had killed in combat, faceless enemies who had probably also been scared boys far from home, who had probably also had wives and mothers and dreams of a future that would never come. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing, and he understood that guilt and gratitude could exist simultaneously in the human heart, that it was possible to mourn what you had been while being grateful for what you were becoming. The dinner at the Mackenzie Ranch became a regular occurrence, not every week but often enough to establish a pattern, a new tradition that felt both extraordinary and entirely natural. Other ranchers began following suit, inviting their prison workers to share meals with their families, integrating them into the social fabric of the community in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. The prisoners found themselves sitting at tables across the county, eating roast beef and apple pie, playing cards with cowboys after dinner, helping with dishes while talking to ranch wives about recipes and weather and the small triumphs and tragedies of daily life. Franz became particularly close to the Morrison family, whose youngest son was near his age and had been killed at Anzio. Mrs. Morrison saw in Franz perhaps an echo of her lost boy, and she fed him with the fierce determination of a mother who had no one else to nurture. Franz, who had been half-starved when captured, filled out under her care, his hollow cheeks rounding, his eyes losing some of their haunted quality. He learned to play baseball with the Morrisons' surviving son, Tommy, who was 12 and delighted to have someone who would throw the ball with him for hours. They communicated more through laughter and gesture than words, but their friendship was real, built on the solid foundation of shared games and the uncomplicated affection of youth. Werner found himself adopted by an elderly couple, the Johnsons, whose own children had scattered across the country in pursuit of opportunities that small-town Texas could not provide. Mr. Johnson was a retired professor who had taught literature at a small college before retiring to ranch life, and he hungered for intellectual conversation in ways his cowboy neighbors could not satisfy. He and Werner would spend evenings on the Johnsons' porch discussing Goethe and Shakespeare, arguing about philosophy and poetry in a mixture of German and English that neither spoke perfectly but both understood sufficiently. Mrs. Johnson would bring them tea and cookies and smile at their animated debates, happy to have life and argument filling her house again. Klaus found his place at the Mackenzie table, becoming almost a fixture there, present for Sunday dinners and holiday meals, helping with ranch projects that extended beyond his official work duties. He taught Sarah and her younger brother, Bobby, how to carve wood, sharing the skills his own father had taught him, passing on knowledge that spanned continents and generations. He made Sarah a jewelry box with intricate inlay work, spending weeks on it in his spare time, pouring into it all his gratitude and affection for this family that had opened their lives to him. When he presented it to her on her 17th birthday, she cried and hugged him with unself-conscious warmth, and Mrs. Mackenzie had to turn away to hide her own tears. The transformation was not without complications or moments of tension. Some in the community disapproved of fraternizing with the enemy, viewing it as a betrayal of American boys fighting and dying overseas. There were letters to the newspaper, heated discussions at town meetings, accusations of being soft on the Germans. But the ranchers who had come to know their prisoner workers defended them with surprising ferocity. Mackenzie stood up at a town hall and said bluntly, "These men aren't the enemy. The enemy is whoever thinks it's wrong to show common decency to another human being. Anyone who disagrees with that can take it up with me personally." His size and reputation as a man not to be trifled with ended that particular conversation. The prisoners themselves navigated their situation with care, understanding that they occupied a precarious position between two worlds. Among themselves, in the privacy of the barracks, they processed the complex emotions of their situation. Some felt guilt at their comfort while their comrades still suffered in Europe. Others worried that they were betraying their country by accepting American hospitality. A few clung to Nazi ideology, viewing the kindness as weakness or trickery, refusing to participate in the social integration even as most of their fellows embraced it. These ideological holdouts became increasingly isolated, their rigidity seeming brittle and hollow in the face of genuine human connection. Klaus found himself changing in ways both subtle and profound. The propaganda that had filled his head for years began to seem thin and unconvincing when measured against the reality of the people he now knew. These Americans were not the decadent, weak enemies he had been taught to despise. They were hard workers, devoted to their families, generous with strangers, faithful in their beliefs. They were, he realized with something like shock, not fundamentally different from the people he had known in his village in Bavaria. They worried about their children, took pride in their work, hoped for rain, loved their land, faced hardship with stoic determination. The supposed vast gulf between cultures turned out to be a shallow stream that could be easily crossed by anyone willing to take the first step. The letters he wrote to Greta evolved over the months, shifting from descriptions of hardship and longing to something more complicated. He told her about the Mackenzies, about learning to work with cattle, about the vastness of the prairie and the kindness of strangers. He tried to explain the confusion he felt at being treated well by people he had been prepared to fight, the way it challenged everything he thought he understood about the world. He did not know if his letters reached her, communication was sporadic and uncertain, but writing them helped him process his own transformation, giving shape to feelings that might otherwise have remained formless and overwhelming. The seasons turned, summer's brutal heat giving way to fall's crisp mornings, and then to a winter that was surprisingly harsh in that flat land where the wind had nothing to slow its knife-edge passage. The prisoners were issued warmer clothes, and the ranchers made sure they had adequate protection against the cold. Christmas approached, a holiday fraught with complex emotions for men far from home, and the community debated what, if anything, should be done to acknowledge it. The solution came from an unlikely source, Reverend Patterson, the Methodist minister, who proposed a Christmas Eve service that would include both townspeople and prisoners, a shared celebration of peace and hope even in the midst of ongoing war. The service was held in the largest church in town, its simple white walls decorated with pine boughs and candles that cast flickering shadows on the assembled faces. The prisoners sat together near the back, uncertain of their welcome, but as the service progressed, they were invited to come forward. Werner, whose strong tenor voice had once sung in a Berlin choir, began to sing Silent Night in German, his voice clear and beautiful in the hushed space. After a moment of surprise, the congregation joined in English, the two languages weaving together, creating something richer than either alone. Klaus felt his throat constrict, overwhelmed by the impossible beauty of former enemies sharing a hymn about peace, about the hope that light would come even into the darkest night. After the service, the community hall hosted a potluck dinner, and the prisoners found themselves welcomed with handshakes and embraces, offered plates piled high with turkey and ham, sweet potatoes and cornbread, pies of every description. Children who had initially viewed them with fearful curiosity now climbed on their laps and showed them drawings and asked them to tell stories about snow in Germany. Old women pressed wrapped cookies into their hands with instructions to share with the boys back at camp. Men who had lost sons in the war nonetheless clapped them on the shoulder and wished them well, performing small miracles of forgiveness that left the prisoners humbled and awed. Franz found himself talking with the widow of a man killed at Normandy, a conversation that should have been impossible but somehow worked because she needed to speak her grief and he needed to acknowledge his part in the larger tragedy, and they met in that painful middle ground where mourning transcends nationality. She told him about her husband's love of fishing, his terrible jokes, the way he sang off-key in the shower. Franz listened with tears streaming down his face and told her about his best friend who had died at Stalingrad, and they cried together for all the senseless loss, all the potential never realized, all the futures cancelled by war's brutal calculus. That night, walking back to camp under stars that seemed impossibly bright in the cold air, Klaus felt something settle inside him, some essential piece clicking into place. He understood now that he had been given a gift, though he could not have articulated exactly what it was. Perhaps it was simply the gift of being seen, of being recognized as human rather than as enemy. Perhaps it was the gift of witnessing kindness in a world that had shown him mostly cruelty. Perhaps it was the gift of learning that redemption was possible, that men could change, that the categories that seemed so absolute during war were actually fluid and negotiable in the face of genuine relationship. The war in Europe finally ground to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, news reaching the camp in fragments and rumor before official confirmation arrived. Germany had fallen. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. Hitler was dead. The prisoners received this news with mixed emotions, relief that the killing was over, grief for their devastated homeland, shame at what was being revealed about the concentration camps, uncertainty about what the future held. They were still prisoners, still awaiting their fate, but the nature of their imprisonment had shifted. They were no longer combatants held temporarily but defeated soldiers waiting to return to a country that no longer existed as they had known it. The process of repatriation was slow and bureaucratic, with men being shipped home in stages over many months. As the camp population dwindled, those remaining felt the approaching end with complicated feelings. They wanted to go home, desperately, but many had grown attached to this strange life, these unexpected friendships, this place that had shown them a different version of themselves. Klaus found himself torn between his longing for Greta and his fear of leaving behind the Mackenzies and the life he had built in this unlikely refuge. When his turn finally came to leave, the Mackenzies drove to the camp to say goodbye. Mrs. Mackenzie brought a care package filled with food for the journey, practical items he might need, and a letter addressed to Greta that she had carefully composed with Franz's help translating her English into German. Sarah gave him a photograph of the family standing in front of their house, everyone squinting into the sun, and on the back, she had written in careful script, "Don't forget us." Klaus could barely speak, his throat tight with emotion, and Mackenzie, understanding perhaps better than anyone, simply pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace and said, "You're a good man, Klaus. Go home and build something good." The journey back across the Atlantic was somber, the ship crowded with men who no longer quite knew where they belonged. They were going home, yes, but to what? To cities destroyed, families scattered, an economy in ruins, a future uncertain. Klaus stood at the rail and watched America disappear over the horizon, feeling as though he was leaving part of himself behind, some essential piece that would forever remain in the vast prairies of Texas, at a dinner table where enemies had become something close to family. Germany was worse than he had imagined, a landscape of rubble and despair, cities reduced to skeletal remains, people hollow-eyed with hunger and grief. He made his way to his village through a country he barely recognized, traveling on foot when trains did not run, sleeping in the ruins of bombed-out buildings, sharing what little food he had with strangers who had even less. When he finally reached his home, he found the house damaged but standing, and Greta waiting with a patience that broke his heart. She was thinner than he remembered, aged by years of worry and scarcity, but her eyes were the same, and when she opened her arms, he fell into them and wept like a child. He told her everything over the following weeks and months, trying to make her understand what had happened to him in that strange captivity that had felt more like liberation. He showed her the photograph of the Mackenzies, read her the letter from Mrs. Mackenzie that welcomed her with warmth and extended an invitation to visit if ever they could manage it. Greta listened to his stories of cowboy ranchers and prairie dinners with something like wonder, trying to reconcile this version of America with the one they had been taught to hate. She told him that his letters had sustained her, that his descriptions of kindness had given her hope when hope seemed impossible. Klaus returned to his trade as a carpenter, helping to rebuild what war had destroyed, and as he worked, he thought often of the skills he had learned on the Mackenzie Ranch, the way problems could be solved with patience and ingenuity, the value of work done well for its own sake. He taught these lessons to the young men who came to apprentice with him, passing on not just carpentry but a philosophy of life learned in an unexpected classroom. He spoke English to Greta every evening, teaching her what he had learned, keeping that part of himself alive, and she learned with diligence because she wanted to access that piece of his experience, to understand fully what had changed him. The years passed with their burdens of reconstruction and recovery, and Germany slowly, painfully, rebuilt itself. Klaus and Greta had children, a daughter and then a son, and he told them stories about Texas that sounded like fairy tales, vast landscapes where you could see forever, cattle that numbered in the thousands, cowboys who invited their prisoners to family dinners. The children's eyes grew wide with wonder, and they asked him to tell the stories again and again, particularly the one about Christmas Eve when enemies sang together in a church lit by candles. Klaus maintained correspondence with the Mackenzies, letters that crossed the ocean carrying news and photographs, maintaining a connection that defied geography and the passage of time. He saw Sarah marry and have children of her own, saw Bobby grow into a rancher like his father, saw Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie age with the grace of people who had lived good lives. He sent photographs of his own family, reports of his work, descriptions of Germany rising from its ashes. The letters were lifelines connecting two worlds, proof that what had happened was real and not some fever dream born of wartime desperation. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Klaus finally saved enough money to bring his family to America for a visit. The journey was long and expensive, requiring sacrifices and careful planning, but it felt necessary, a pilgrimage to a place that had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. They flew into Dallas and drove north through landscape that Klaus had described so many times his children felt they already knew it. And then they were turning onto the familiar road that led to the Mackenzie Ranch, and the house was ahead of them, looking exactly as he remembered it, and figures were emerging onto the porch, waving, calling welcomes. Mrs. Mackenzie was grayer but still vital, her embrace as warm as he remembered. Mackenzie himself moved more slowly, arthritis in his knees from years of hard work, but his handshake was still firm, his eyes still sharp and kind. Sarah was there with her husband and 3 children, and Bobby with his wife and their young son. They swept Klaus and his family into the house with exclamations and laughter, and suddenly they were all sitting around that same dining table, now expanded with extra leaves to accommodate everyone, and Mrs. Mackenzie was bringing out platters of food just as she had 2 decades before. Greta sat beside Klaus, her hand finding his under the table, and he knew she was feeling what he felt, the uncanny sense of being in a place that existed in memory and was now revealed to be just as real as remembered, just as warm, just as welcoming. His daughter, shy at first with her limited English, gradually relaxed as Sarah's children drew her into their games, the universal language of childhood transcending all barriers. His son talked with Bobby about ranching, his eyes bright with fascination as Bobby described the challenges and rewards of the life. After dinner, they sat on the porch as Klaus had done so many times before, watching the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in those impossible colors that seemed to exist nowhere else. Mackenzie poured whiskey, and this time Klaus's glass was joined by Greta's, and they toasted to friendship, to peace, to the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. "You know," Mackenzie said thoughtfully, "there were a lot of folks who thought we were crazy, treating you boys the way we did. Thought we were being unpatriotic or soft. But I never doubted it was the right thing. And seeing you here now, seeing your beautiful family, knowing you made it through and built a good life, that just confirms it. Sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to hate." Klaus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked at his children playing in the yard with the Mackenzie grandchildren, at Greta laughing with Mrs. Mackenzie over some shared observation, at the vast prairie stretching out to meet the darkening sky, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the accident of fate that had brought him to this place, to these people, who had shown him that even in the midst of war's worst darkness, human decency could persist, that kindness was a choice available even to those who might justifiably withhold it, that the lines we draw between us and them are often arbitrary and can be erased by anyone brave enough to simply see the person rather than the category. As they prepared to leave at the end of their visit, Mrs. Mackenzie pressed another care package into Greta's hands, and Sarah gave Klaus's daughter a jewelry box to match the one he had made for her so long ago, a gift acknowledging the connection that spanned generations. Mackenzie walked Klaus out to the car, his hand on Klaus's shoulder, and said simply, "You're always welcome here. This is your home too, whenever you need it." Klaus embraced him, this man who had changed his life by the simple act of sharing a meal, who had refused to see an enemy and had instead found a friend. The flight back to Germany was quieter, each member of Klaus's family lost in their own reflections on what they had experienced. His daughter asked him, "Papa, why were they so nice to you during the war? Weren't you supposed to be enemies?" Klaus considered the question carefully, searching for words that could encompass the complexity of what he had lived through. Finally, he said, "I think some people understand that being enemies is temporary, but being human is permanent. The Mackenzies chose to see our humanity even when it would have been easier not to. That's a kind of courage, maybe the most important kind." Years continued to pass, marked by letters and occasional phone calls once that technology became more accessible, by photographs documenting the gradual arc of aging and growth, by the steady accumulation of shared history. Klaus watched his children grow and have children of their own, and he told his grandchildren the same stories he had told their parents, about cowboys and prairies and people who chose kindness over hatred. He watched Germany transform itself, becoming prosperous and democratic, shedding its dark past while refusing to forget it, and he felt proud of his small part in its reconstruction. When Mackenzie died in 1982, Klaus made the journey back to Texas for the funeral, his hair gray now, his hands marked by a lifetime of work. He stood in the same church where they had once sung Christmas carols in 2 languages, listening as people testified to Mackenzie's character, his fairness, his generosity, his unshakable moral compass. When it was Klaus's turn to speak, he talked about what Mackenzie had taught him without ever claiming to teach, that courage sometimes looks like inviting your enemy to dinner, that patriotism can mean refusing to dehumanize, that the most lasting victories are won not on battlefields but at kitchen tables where we learn to see each other clearly. Mrs. Mackenzie held his hand afterward and thanked him for coming such a long way. Tom always said that having you boys there during the war, treating you like people, that was one of the things he was most proud of in his life, she said. He believed it mattered, that it changed things somehow, made the world just a little bit better. I want you to know he was right. Look at you, look at your beautiful family, look at what you've built. That's his legacy too, in a way. That's what choosing kindness can do. Klaus returned to Germany carrying that affirmation like a talisman, a confirmation that the strange period of his life had meaning beyond his own experience, that it represented something larger about human possibility. He began writing down his memories in detail, wanting to preserve them before age and death claimed them. He wrote about the fear of that first train ride into unknown country, about learning to work with cattle under vast skies, about the taste of Mrs. Mackenzie's roast chicken, about Christmas Eve in the church, about the moment he realized that enemies could become friends if given the chance. His grandchildren read his writings with fascination, struggling to imagine their dignified grandfather as a young prisoner of war, trying to reconcile the horrors he had experienced in combat with the almost magical kindness he had found in Texas. They asked him questions that he answered as honestly as he could, not hiding the darkness but also not dwelling on it, instead focusing on what he had learned about resilience and redemption and the surprising capacity of the human heart to heal. Werner had maintained his own connection with the Johnson family, visiting them several times over the decades until first Mr. Johnson and then his wife passed away, leaving their small ranch to a nephew who had no interest in maintaining it. Werner mourned them as he would have mourned his own parents, these people who had given him back his love of literature and conversation, who had treated him like the son they missed. Franz, the youngest of their group, had returned to Germany and completed his engineering degree, eventually moving to America permanently in the 1950s, settling in California but making annual pilgrimages to Texas to visit the Morrison family, maintaining that bond forged when he was barely more than a boy. The 3 of them, Klaus, Werner, and Franz, stayed in touch throughout their lives, their shared experience in Texas creating a connection that transcended ordinary friendship. They met when they could, their reunions filled with reminiscence and laughter and the particular understanding that comes from having survived something together. They talked about how their time as prisoners had shaped their futures, how it had given them a framework for understanding mercy and justice, how it had complicated their relationships with nationalism and patriotism, teaching them that loyalty to humanity might sometimes supersede loyalty to country. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a documentary filmmaker contacted Klaus, having heard his story through a mutual acquaintance. The filmmaker wanted to record the testimonies of former POWs about their experiences in America, creating an oral history before that generation passed away entirely. Klaus agreed, and found himself sitting in front of a camera, trying to articulate what those years had meant, how they had transformed him, why they mattered beyond his personal narrative. People think of prisoner of war camps and they imagine brutality, he said, his English now fluent though still accented, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. And there was brutality in many places, terrible suffering. But what happened in Texas, on those ranches, in those homes, that was something different. Those people didn't have to be kind. The Geneva Convention required them to feed us and house us, but it didn't require them to invite us to Christmas dinner, to teach our children to carve wood, to treat us like family. They did that because they chose to see us as individuals rather than as representatives of a regime they were fighting. That choice, that refusal to dehumanize, that's what saved me, really. Not just physically but spiritually. It gave me back my humanity at a time when I had almost forgotten I had any. The documentary was broadcast in both Germany and America, generating unexpected interest and emotion. Other former POWs came forward with their own stories of kindness received in unlikely places: farms in Iowa, logging camps in Minnesota, construction projects in Louisiana. A pattern emerged of individual Americans who had looked at the prisoners assigned to them and had made a conscious decision to treat them with dignity, creating small pockets of grace in the midst of global conflict. Not everyone had experienced this, certainly. There were stories of mistreatment and prejudice as well, but the accounts of generosity were numerous enough to suggest something significant about a particular American impulse toward fairness and the frontier ethic of judging people by their actions rather than their origins. The broadcast led to reunions, former prisoners traveling back to America to find the families who had hosted them, children and grandchildren of both prisoners and hosts meeting for the first time, forging new connections based on old bonds. There were tearful embraces at airports, multi-generational gatherings where old men told stories while young people listened with wonder, photographs taken to document these unlikely reunions born from war and sustained by peace. Klaus found himself part of this larger narrative, his personal story woven into a broader tapestry of human decency persisting against the odds. Sarah Mackenzie, now a grandmother herself, appeared in the documentary alongside Klaus, describing what it had been like to have German prisoners at her family's table, how strange and wonderful it had seemed, how it had shaped her understanding of the world. "My parents taught me that everyone deserves to be treated with respect until they prove they don't deserve it," she said. "These men had been fighting against our country, yes, but they hadn't done anything personally to harm us, and they were working hard and being respectful. It seemed natural to be kind to them. I think my parents also understood that hatred is exhausting, that you can't sustain it without it poisoning you. Kindness was just easier, and it felt better. Plus," she added with a smile, "Klaus made me that beautiful jewelry box, and I still have it, still use it. Every time I open it, I remember that people are complicated, that we're all capable of both terrible things and wonderful things, and that we get to choose which we want to amplify." As Klaus entered his 80s and then his 90s, he became increasingly reflective about the arc of his life, the way history had shaped him and he had shaped his small portion of history in turn. He had lived through war and peace, destruction and reconstruction, enmity and friendship. He had been a soldier, a prisoner, a carpenter, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather. He had witnessed the worst of humanity and some of the best. He had learned that abstractions, nationalism, ideology, racial theory, collapsed when confronted with actual individual human beings in all their specificity and complexity. His health began to fail in his mid-90s, his body finally succumbing to the cumulative weight of years. As he lay in his bed in the house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by his family, he thought not about the battles he had fought or the hardships he had endured but about that first dinner at the Mackenzie Ranch, the way Mrs. Mackenzie had served him chicken and potatoes with the same care she showed her own family, the way Mackenzie had offered him whiskey as though they were equals. He thought about Sarah's hug on her 17th birthday, about Warner's conversations with Mr. Johnson on that distant porch, about Franz playing baseball with Tommy Morrison. He thought about Christmas Eve singing Silent Night in German while the church around him sang in English, two languages praising the same hope for peace. "Did I ever tell you," he said to his daughter, who was sitting beside his bed holding his hand, "about the first time Mackenzie offered me water from his own canteen? I thought it was a trick. I couldn't imagine why he would share with me. But he just thrust it at me impatiently, like I was being foolish to hesitate. And I drank, and the water was so cold and good, and I realized in that moment that kindness isn't complicated. It's actually very simple. You just have to decide to do it." His daughter squeezed his hand, tears running down her face. "You taught us that, Papa. Every day of our lives, you taught us that." Klaus smiled, his eyes closing, and in his mind he was young again, standing under that vast Texas sky, learning to mend fences and herd cattle and believe in the possibility of goodness even in a world that had shown him so much cruelty. He could smell Mrs. Mackenzie's cooking, hear the creak of the porch swing, feel the satisfaction of a day's honest work completed. He could see Mackenzie's weathered face breaking into a smile, hear Sarah's laughter, taste the whiskey they shared while watching the sun set over the endless prairie. "Thank you," he whispered, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to his daughter or to the Mackenzies or to whatever force in the universe had brought him to that ranch in Texas so many years ago, giving him a glimpse of who he could become if he let go of who he had been trained to be. "Thank you for showing me." And then he was gone, slipping away peacefully, his last thoughts full of gratitude and grace, his life a testament to the transformative power of simple human kindness, his story one small bright thread in the vast tapestry of human experience, proving that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose light, who extend hands across divides, who feed their enemies and in doing so, transform them into friends. The obituary in the local German newspaper was brief, noting his work as a carpenter, his service in the war, his loving family. But the obituary that appeared in the Hereford, Texas newspaper was longer, written by Sarah's son, who had heard the stories all his life and felt compelled to honor this man who had been, in a sense, part of his family though they shared no blood. It told the story of the German POW who came to West Texas expecting imprisonment and isolation, who found instead acceptance and friendship, who learned that the categories we use to divide ourselves from each other are less powerful than our common humanity. It told of dinners shared and fences mended and Christmas carols sung in 2 languages. It told of a man who had been transformed by kindness and had spent the rest of his life trying to pass that transformation forward. The story was picked up by larger papers, shared on the early internet, becoming one of those tales that people send to each other when the news feels too dark, when hatred seems to be winning, when despair threatens to overwhelm hope. It became a reminder that ordinary people making small choices to be decent can have profound impacts, that the antidote to war's dehumanization is the stubborn insistence on seeing and treating each other as fully human, that bridges can be built even across the widest chasms if someone is willing to take the first step. Years after Klaus's death, his granddaughter made her own pilgrimage to Texas, bringing with her copies of her grandfather's writings and photographs from his time there. She met with Sarah, now in her 90s and still sharp, still living in a small house near the old ranch property. They sat together looking at the photographs, 2 women separated by generation and nationality but connected by a history of kindness that had rippled forward through time. "Your grandfather was a good man," Sarah said, her voice still strong despite her age. "But I think he always was a good man, even when he was wearing that uniform, even when he was fighting in that terrible war. My parents just gave him space to remember that about himself. That's all any of us really need sometimes, someone to remind us of our better selves, to believe in us even when we're not sure we deserve it." She showed Klaus's granddaughter the jewelry box, still beautiful after all these years, its wood still glowing with the care that had been put into its creation. "This has been one of my most treasured possessions," she said. "Not because of its monetary value, though it's beautifully made, but because of what it represents. It's proof that even in the worst circumstances, beauty can be created, that craftsmanship and care can persist, that giving and gratitude can survive war's attempt to destroy everything decent in us." Klaus's granddaughter returned to Germany with her own stories to tell, her own photographs documenting this latest chapter in a saga that had begun decades before, when a train full of prisoners rolled into a small Texas town and the people there made a choice that would echo through generations. She wrote about her journey, adding her voice to her grandfather's, ensuring that the story would continue, that future generations would know about the cowboys who invited their enemies to dinner, about the prisoners who learned that kindness could be as powerful as any weapon, about the families on both sides who proved that human connection could transcend national identity. The story became part of the curriculum in some schools, used to teach children about the complexity of war, about the difference between governments and individuals, about the moral courage required to refuse to hate, about the long-term consequences of choosing generosity over vengeance. Students wrote essays about what they would have done in the Mackenzie's position, whether they would have had the courage to see past the uniform to the person wearing it, what it means to be patriotic when patriotism is defined not as hatred of enemies but as fidelity to values, particularly the value of human dignity. And in a small museum in Hereford, Texas, there is an exhibit about the POW camp that once stood nearby, about the prisoners who worked on local ranches, about the families who welcomed them into their homes. There are photographs of Germans and Americans standing together, smiling in front of farmhouses and cattle pens. There are letters written in 2 languages, speaking of friendship and gratitude. There is a replica of the jewelry box Klaus made, demonstrating the level of craftsmanship and care he was capable of. There are oral history recordings of old men and women, their voices wavering with age but firm with conviction, testifying to what they witnessed, a small miracle of human decency in the midst of global conflict. The exhibit's final panel contains Klaus's words from the documentary, blown up large enough to read from across the room. Those people didn't have to be kind. They chose to be kind. And that choice changed my life, changed my understanding of what was possible, changed who I became. I went home to Germany and built a good life, raised good children, tried to be a good man. I owe that, in part, to some cowboys in Texas who looked at a German prisoner and saw a human being who deserved a place at their table. I hope I passed forward what they gave me. I hope my children and grandchildren carry it forward too. That's how the world changes, not through grand gestures but through small acts of decency, repeated again and again, until they become not the exception but the expectation. And so the story persists, told and retold, adapted and embellished, but always returning to its essential truth, that in a time of terrible division and violence, some people chose connection instead of separation, kindness instead of cruelty, hope instead of despair. They chose to feed their enemies, and in doing so, they transformed enemies into friends, prisoners into guests, strangers into family. They proved that even in war's darkest shadow, light can persist if people are brave enough to strike the match, to extend the hand, to set the extra place at the table, to see the human being behind the uniform, to believe that redemption is always possible and that the future is not predetermined by the past but can be shaped by the choices we make in each present moment, choices that ripple forward in ways we cannot always predict but that matter profoundly nonetheless, creating currents of grace that can carry us all towards something better than what came before.